Welcome to The Culture Shift. We want this podcast to empower you as leaders to make impactful change in your workplace. I'm Vicki Baars, and I specialise in transforming organisations through equity, diversity and inclusion initiatives. In each episode, we'll delve deep into the fascinating world of workplace culture. Join me as I sit down with an array of incredible guests, including members of our very own Culture Shift team and industry experts. Through these thought-provoking conversations, we aim to equip you with the knowledge, tools, and inspiration you need to drive positive change in your workplace. Whether it's breaking down barriers, thinking about how you include a more diverse workforce, or fostering a culture of collaboration and belonging, we've got you covered. So let's dive straight into an episode. Hello and welcome to the very first episode of The Culture Shift. Today I'm delighted to be joined by Gemma McCall, co-founder and CEO of Culture Shift. For our first episode, we think a great place to start would be looking back over the last few decades of work and what created the workplaces we know today, how society has changed within the working world, and what cultural challenges this presents. But before we delve into this topic, I think it would be helpful for us to give a bit of context to who Culture Shift are and how we came to be. So Gemma, tell us a bit about Culture Shift.
Culture Shift is a tech for good organisation that we founded in January 2018. The work of Culture Shift, though, kind of predates that date when we wanted to create a piece of software that removed barriers to reporting at universities. There was some research conducted by the NUS into the experiences of female students at universities when it came to sexual harassment and sexual violence. And some of the statistics that were found in that piece of research were startling. They found that during their time at university, 60% of female students would experience sexual harassment or sexual violence. And then further research found that less than 2% of those people who experienced it would report to their university and seek support for what they've been through. And then some other research highlighted that about 25% of women would leave university because of those of those experiences. And it was just a sort of moment for me, like finding out that those statistics, because they're so stark, and behind those statistics are hundreds of women who have gone to university to study, removing themselves from those environments because they're unsafe. And the fact that people weren't going to university to seek support was a bit confounding to me. Like, I didn't really understand it. So we collaborated with the University of Manchester and their students' union to understand maybe some of the easier barriers to reporting that we could help remove by taking the process online. And so our first system went live in 2017, I think. And we had the anonymous reporting sort of route, which immediately is kind of removes a big barrier to people when they can keep their anonymity. And the whole thing kind of started from there. Our work has broadened now to allowing people to report any kind of bullying, harassment or discrimination or mental wellbeing concern that they experience or witness. We work with most of the universities across the UK, but we've always known that these hidden problems exist across our society, and absolutely exist every single day in the workplace. So our work has broadened out into various different workplaces across the UK and beyond.
Yeah, and I think it's helpful as well to point out that like universities are also workplaces, right? Yes. So as well as students taking advantage of the reporting platform that we provide, so do staff who work in higher education too.
Yeah, exactly. And then, like, removing the barriers to staff reporting at universities is like a very specific challenge that we have, because the safety to speak up doesn't necessarily exist very well. So, you know, we need to do all that we can to help create those safe spaces.
Yeah, massively. And so I guess today we are thinking about what a workplace is, how the workplaces we know today, and obviously they're many and varied, but we're probably going to talk about the kinds of organisations we work with, which tend to be large organisations with in the thousands and tens of thousands of employees, right? Yeah. And we're talking about often office-based or remote-based working, but obviously we do also span, you know, people who work in hospital environments and shift work, and so, you know, workplaces are not homogenous. I think that's really important for us to say at the beginning. But there's certainly, you know, the workplace has changed in the last, say, 100 years. You know, offices didn't really exist in the concept of how we know them now, and certainly remote working has been, you know, much more prevalent in recent years. So I guess, yeah, it'd be interesting to hear your thoughts around how the workplace has evolved over time, and how that's maybe impacting workplace cultures.
Yeah, I think in order to sort of answer and reflect on that, I think looking at where we are now, which is a situation where a lot of places offer hybrid working, a lot of organisations, you know, and that's something that's quite new. Also, I think there is a global understanding in the Western world anyway, about how more diverse workforces make for better business. There's so much research and, you know, reports and statistics that we can look into that kind of prove that point.
Oh, and we will on another episode, don't worry. We absolutely plan to cover that in a few episodes' time, in fact.
So if that's sort of where we are today, with that like recognition of understanding that makes a better place of work, we've had organisations who have wanted to get to that position, but society has had to sort of catch up with that kind of way of thinking, if you like. So, you know, what we had not that long ago is kind of like, I don't know, I always think of it like the world of Mad Men, where it was like, you know, women were secretaries and like the men did the important jobs and the highly paid jobs. And, you know, Mad Men is based at that kind of real pivotal time of like late 50s, 60s, 70s, where...
So Mad Men's a TV show, right?
Sorry. Yes,
I'm not familiar with it.
Yeah, so Mad Men is a TV series about... an advertising agency in the sort of 50s and 60s, and season 1 starts, and it like all of the women are secretaries, all of the men
all wearing skirts and heels,
all wearing skirts and heels, like literally, like, you know, heels like measured and things like that. And it's really interesting because, you know, as the seasons progress, it's that changing face that we all experienced across the late 50s, 60s and 70s. And protections, attitudes, legislation had to catch up with people's ambitions to better themselves and further themselves, and not be put in a box of like, okay, I'm a woman, I can only be a secretary, and I could try and be ultimately be the boss of all the secretaries, but that's it for me. Yeah. And women, you know, in particular, I'm going to talk about that just because that's like my personal experience, them not being content with that and kind of like pushing the boundaries and asking why and demanding more. And that, you know, has happened sort of across various different areas of our society, and workplaces have had to cope and catch up with those changing ambitions, let's say.
Yeah, and rises in expectations as well, right? I think, the workforce has, moved along with big social movements. So, it's not surprising that legislation changed a lot in the 70s after like swathes of feminist activism and racial equality activism and disability rights activism and gay rights activism. And, all of these things were happening in wider society, and it will have influenced the workplace. People began to think that they deserved to be treated better than they were, and expectations rose, and that's continued to change throughout generations that are joining the workforce. And there is like generational differences in what people expect, but I think it's really important to remember and reflect actually that we have people in the workforce who predate some of that legislation, who predate some of the sort of information architecture that we have now. Like, the people who are graduating from university, fresh out of school, going to university, obviously lots of people leave university as mature students, but those who are coming straight out, having gone there straight after school, they have so much information at the end of their fingertips in a way that, we as millennials didn't have, but certainly generations above us who are still in the workforce, definitely didn't have. Like, some people who are still in the workforce, there wasn't the internet. They started and so like bridging that expectation gap as well, it's really interesting to see like how that benefits everyone in the workforce, and I think there's a lot of people from all generations who see that and embrace that, and I think that makes for a really helpful environment when it comes to cultivating cultures where people can feel like safe and happy in the workplace.
Yeah, definitely. But I think it's challenging as like the things that make that we recognize as being really positive steps forward for workplaces today. There are challenges in getting to those places as well, and like you say, there's such a wide and broad range of people and experiences and ages in our workplaces today that and that we all have to live harmoniously with and work harmoniously with one another, and that's not always easy, which is, I guess, why we as Culture Shift exist.
Gives us work to do.
It does.
So when we talk about the history of the workplace, perhaps it's useful to talk about some of the hard-fought wins that I guess trade unions and activists sort of worked for over the last decades. So we talked about sort of particular social movements, but obviously there's like key pieces of legislation that trade unions fought for to have protections in the workplace. And you said you're quite interested in talking about things from your personal experience. Do you want to share with us a bit about maybe some thoughts on that?
Yeah, definitely. So my personal experience was that I had a very seamless and easy work life when I entered the workplace, and I came to work every day. If I went for a job, I generally got it, and moved up the career ladder in a fairly sort of easy way. I remember once putting on my CV, I was going for a new job, and I remember once putting on my CV that I was newly married and that I liked to go travelling with my new husband. I think my dad read it, was just proofreading for me, and was like, "Oh, I wouldn't put that in on your CV because people might think that you'll have a baby soon." And I was like, "Oh, that was sort of that shows how protected, I guess, I was completely asleep to the fact that that might be a thing, and that people might not be like, oh, congratulations on your wedding, where are you going to go next, kind of thing." So it was my first kind of realization. And then when I did have kids, I experienced maternity discrimination, not once but twice. I've got 2 kids, and it happened both times.
Wow.
The first time that it happened, it really kicked me in the ass. I won't lie. your experience of motherhood and like becoming a mum and adjusting to motherhood, that first year is a very surreal year, really. But I always knew that I wanted to be a working mum, but as the time was kind of coming closer to me coming back to work, I was starting to think of like, will I still be able to do it? Because I was just totally in this kind of cocooned like new baby world, basically. So I started to have those like doubts in myself, and then the letter popped through the door one day to say you've been made redundant, and I can remember opening the letter and reading it, and it was just me and Millie in the house, and just looking at her and sobbing. And she started crying because like she could see that I was really, really upset, and just thinking, I've been so... I've blamed myself. I felt like I'd been really reckless in like having a child, basically, because like I had to, you know,
just so unfair on you.
Yeah, and it was real. I can remember it so clearly, like it was yesterday. Remember all the feelings and everything. And so I got another job, but it wasn't like what I wanted, really. Like I went back full time because my perception was that there weren't any part-time roles, and so I just had to go full time, and that was it. And then something similar-ish happened the second time, when I had my son Ronnie, and but that time the thing that was different was that social media had connected me with other working mums, and if the first time I was really isolated and completely blamed myself for not being good enough, the second time round I was like, hang on a minute, this is happening to thousands of women. It's not me, because I've gone back to work and I've proven to myself and the world that I can be a mum and be someone who goes to work. And it was just an eye-opening moment for me that second time, because I'd been connected with other communities and that I felt like very empowered by that, basically. And so I guess that awoke the activist in me, because I wanted to deal with those situations by trying to solve them. And so I kind of went into working with mums who had like started their own businesses whilst they were on maternity leave, and built this like little networking group. And at the time I was working at my old business, which is called Trust, with Carl, who's one of the co-founders of Culture Shift. And that's when we started working with the University of Manchester. And that kind of the like what Culture Shift is formed to do has kind of given a home to that activism, I guess. But it happens to so many people, even though there is legislation to protect people, and you know, some of that legislation, I'm pleased to say, is strengthening. It's about to strengthen even more because of campaigners like Pregnant Then Screwed and Mother Pucker, who have been campaigning for better working conditions for working parents. And without those campaigners, you know, we wouldn't. They are hard fought, hard won rights that we have, and we need to keep fighting and keep strengthening them. Yeah,
thanks for sharing that, Gemma. That was, like, you know, I think it's these individual experiences, you know, are important to hear, and I'm sure those listening will appreciate to have that reflection. And as you already said, like the fact that it's not just happening to individuals, like the individual narrative is really powerful, but actually that's one person's story, and you said it's like thousands of people experiencing it. And I guess like there wasn't anything more kind of powerful in recent history than the sort of MeToo movement, in terms of sort of connecting different stories of people who are experiencing harm in all walks of life. Obviously, we're focusing on the workplace, and workplaces certainly did start speaking up, and, you know, Harvey Weinstein being held accountable for his actions, and people speaking out about that. You know, those moments in time, they came at a really pivotal moment, I guess, in Culture Shift's history, because we were already set on a path of trying to be an organisation that is going to prevent and respond to all of these harmful behaviours that happen to people when they're working and studying. So I think it's really like important to reflect, the kind of snowballing effect of those movements and George Floyd's death, and the subsequent I guess increased awareness of like the problem, as we're trying to cover in this episode, is that these things are happening to people day in, day out, and it's all connected. And these things, I think a response we hear from a lot of organisations is, well, it's not just happening here. And that's true. But the point is, it's also happening here, right? And we have to connect what's happening in wider society with what is going on in the day-to-day of people's working lives.
Yeah, definitely. And I think sort of a concern of mine has been that those moments in time that are so important have meant that there has been a global shift in attitudes because of our global connectivity through social media. And social media is a blessing and a curse. It is a blessing in that way that it's not just pockets of activism, it is joined up activism, which is incredible and so powerful. At the same time, obviously, there are huge problems and concerns with social media, but you can't deny that it's connected us as activists so that we can
absolutely
demonstrate the scale of the problem globally.
And platforms have changed to limit that connection, actually. Like they used to be much more effective for that kind of organising, and I do think that this is a whole different podcast probably, but I do think that social media have managed the way that activists connect, and it has helped, but it's also shifted, right? And it's become actually more difficult. We do see like posts sort of not getting the same sort of elevation and traction around these sorts of things, which is a challenge for us as an organisation, but also for anyone who is like challenging the status quo in society.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that, I was concerned because the MeToo movement had momentum behind it, and then with like that kind of early discussion and then ultimate conviction of Harvey Weinstein, it was like we've told the world that this is a problem. We've said this is a problem with this very powerful man, and something's been done about it. And I think that really gave the movement like momentum. I think potentially because of the impact of COVID, that has maybe potentially like harmed the momentum of those movements, because we are now dealing with a global economic crisis, partly down to what happened with COVID, and it worries me because we can't let the work stop. It's really, really important that we keep learning and that we don't take steps back, that we keep moving forward and keep getting better protections for everyone across society, and keep making our places of work better and safer. It's we can't stop just because the times are hard. In fact, we probably need to double down on it and work harder when the times are hard, so that we can be better on the other side. And I'd love to hear people's thoughts on their own experiences of especially if you work in the field of like equity and inclusion, but certainly my experience was it was even more seen as a nice to have during that time. Work that I was doing as a practitioner was very much put on pause or dialed down, or like pivoted to something that felt a little bit more like crisis response perhaps. And some of our longer term big projects around sort of like race equity perhaps, or like LGBTQ plus inclusion, like were paused whilst we reevaluated like how we were getting through the pandemic, and it took a while for the leaders in the organisation I was working with at the time to go, oh, hang on a minute though, we also need to be in our crisis response thinking about like equity and inclusion as well, because we could be going down a dangerous path here, and we were lucky we had receptive leaders, but and we had quite a well-resourced team as a large organisation in the public sector, and so we were able to like make that case well. But I imagine like most organisations weren't equipped to do that, and this work will have taken a back step, and that coupled with
the isolation, perhaps, that like zipping to remote working, having never done that before, and the way that could potentially then, like lead to experiences around bullying and harassment, and how those experiences then are less likely to, like, people are less likely to say something if they're feeling isolated. It's quite concerning, like all of the different, like, social movement impact, but also the like personal workplace impact that COVID had, and how that changed, how we deliver this work.
Definitely, but something that did not slow down is the number of reports being submitted to our system. Like it went up, if anything, and the poor behaviour didn't stop. It shifted in styles, perhaps, but it didn't stop. Like it continues to exist. So we've got to keep up. We've got to keep resourcing the work. Because ultimately all of these things are hidden beneath the surface, like poor behaviour, bullying, harassment and discrimination. You only know a small percentage of it.
The iceberg effect.
Yeah, exactly. You've got to work hard to understand the extent and the size of the iceberg underneath the surface. And when we all went home, that got even harder to be able to hear and see and notice different behaviours, so that those behaviours, poor behaviours, could be challenged and those good behaviours could be celebrated. Now, as we are in a situation where, we're increasingly in more of a hybrid situation, I think it's probably gotten easier, but there's still challenges there. Like, we're recruiting at the moment, and one of the people that we have recruited has said that he felt quite isolated, just being remote all the time, and so was looking for like that balance. And we as organisations have to respond to that, and the response to that's quite expensive, because it means you've got to fund an office. Like a lot of organisations went, do you know what, we can work 100% remotely, so let's get rid of our office, which is on the balance sheet is a good business decision, right? You're saving on that rent, but then to the detriment of your people and your workforce, who won't be doing their best work. And ultimately, that's what you've got to provide, an environment where people can thrive and produce their best work, because ultimately that's going to make your organisation stronger. So it's really important that it continues to be focused on and built upon as we learn more things about the people who work for us.
So we've talked a lot about the history of problems in the workplace when it comes to bullying, harassment, sexual misconduct. But let's bring it to the present day. A recent development that we have been aware of is that Rachel Maskell, MP for York Central, is putting a bill through Parliament to introduce a legal definition of bullying. So it'll be known as the Bullying and Respect at Work Bill. And this is a really exciting development for a lot of reasons, but partly because there hasn't been a legal definition of bullying before. And so organisations have sort of usually an ACAS definition, but this could really strengthen the way in which we respond to bullying specifically in the workplace. And I'm personally quite excited to see how the bill moves through Parliament and the impact it has on addressing some of these issues.
Yeah, I am as well. There's other elements in the bill that I'm quite excited about. That legal definition of bullying, I think, will be really helpful to employers, because it's very open to interpretation at the moment, and it's in the grey areas where the problems happen. So I think that's a really positive element. They've talked about employers having mechanisms for speaking up and reporting, which is obviously of a lot of interest to us here at Culture Shift.
Yeah, our bread and butter.
Absolutely. So the reporting of incidents, the investigating of incidents, which is also something that employers need a lot of help and guidance with. And then part of the bill, or the proposed bill at this moment in time, is going to have a sort of code of conduct, or it's going to be, it's called the Respect at Work Code, and that will, the EHRC, the Equality and Human Rights Commission, will have the ability to enforce that, which I think is a positive thing, because one of the criticisms, one of the many criticisms laid at the door of the EHRC is that it doesn't really have teeth as a regulator. Yeah. We have seen them kind of exercise their rights a little bit more recently with something that we've talked quite a lot about in our like webinars and things, which is called Section 23, which is when the EHRC impose obligations for organisations to prove what they're doing to protect people from sexual harassment in most cases. So they've tried to sort of do as much as they can, but they haven't had a lot of teeth to bear, and if they're given these extra regulatory powers, then I think that's only going to be a positive thing for protecting people in the workplace. In her sort of research and backing up of the bill, I think some of the statistics were quite interesting, because I'm not sure where these figures come from, but she said that 4.9 million UK workers have experienced bullying, and 53% of victims are not reporting it at the moment. So that's over half the workforce. Yeah. And that's, you know, we do this every day. Yeah. And those statistics are shocking to me. And it's because I think organisations talk a lot about nurturing a speak up culture, but in practice don't make that happen. So the bullying exists, and what happens is people just remove themselves from that organisation, which is costing organisations a lot of money when people leave. So you know, and that's not even taking into consideration the personal toll that happens. So I think that bill, it can only be a positive thing, to add more parameters and give organisations better guidance on how and what they should be tackling. Yeah,
and that 53% statistic is shocking, but it's also like, you know, we hear about reasons why people don't report these things day in, day out. And, you know, that might be because they fear they might not be believed. Yeah. It might be that they fear there might be repercussions, and that, you know, they might worry that they might not get the promotions or pay rises that they're aiming for. They may worry that they are being seen as a troublemaker. Mm-hmm. There's like so many different reasons why people are worried about reporting these things. And, you know, it's absolutely imperative that organisations and leaders in organisations in particular really take this very seriously. Mm-hmm. And I think having strengthened legislation, and you know, legislation isn't the be all end all. No. It's imperfect in many ways, and that's a whole other episode. But it is something that people take seriously. The HRC having more teeth is something people will take seriously, and it does mean that, like, hopefully greater investment and resources will go into organisations so they can actually back up what they're saying, because, like, linking it back to what we were talking about earlier, you know, there's all of these kind of big social movements that have made organisations step up and make anti-racism statements, or statements about how they're addressing sexual harassment in the workplace. But it's making sure you're actually got a proper plan in place, and you're resourcing that plan effectively, and then you're evaluating your success against that plan. And so, you know, I'm really excited about the fact that this bill might encourage greater resourcing and more effective prevention of these behaviours in the first place.
Yeah, because just because it's the right thing to do doesn't mean that businesses will do it. So I think morally we can all agree that it's the right thing to do to protect people from bullying, harassment and discrimination. And what legislation can do is put those legal obligations onto employers so that they have to do it.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So thank you so much, Gemma. This has been a really interesting episode, and I think it's really set the scene for why we do what we do at Culture Shift, and why we think it's important to be preventing and responding to bullying, harassment, discrimination, or any form of harm that people experience in the workplace. So today we've talked over, like, the history of the workplace. We've talked about how COVID changed the way we work. We've talked about how social movements have influenced individuals and legislation and how organisations are responding to these issues. And we've talked about what's happening in the present day around sort of, changes that are going through Parliament and how organisations can respond to that. So, yeah, covered a lot there. And I'm really, pleased to have had this opportunity to talk with you about this today, and thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me. I feel very privileged to have been the first person on your podcast, and I wish you all the luck with it, and I know that it's going to be fascinating as we move through the different episodes.
Thanks.
Okay, bye.
Bye. Thank you for tuning into this episode of The Culture Shift. We hope you found it insightful and informative. We really appreciate your support and value your feedback. So if you enjoyed this episode, please leave us a review, share your thoughts, and don't forget to hit the subscribe button to stay updated on when we release new episodes. If you're interested in our other content or how Culture Shift can help your organisation, check out our YouTube channel, website, or drop us a message, and I'll see you next time.